And it's open for questions by commission members and discussion. And I would like to point out, in compliments to all of you, that you've given us the backdrop, if you will, for what we've been talking about as a recommendation about integrating ethics early on into the practice of neuroscience. And as Raju said earlier, while the BRAIN initiative is focused on mapping of the brain, our charge from the president is not meant to be so narrow as to apply only to that research, but to neuroscience research more broadly speaking. So if I could ask any one of you to just follow up, since you were so nicely within your time, and say what you think we should be considering as specifically as you can in recommendations to integrate ethics into neuroscience research. Peggy, maybe we should start with you, because you had some, you're on the front lines of vetting some, but we're taking a step back. So what are the, give me some example of what you think we could recommend that isn't being done right now.
Well, first, I want to reiterate, I think, a comment that Nick made, that the RCR requirement is unfunded, and that is a big problem. That's just a big problem. Secondly, the RCR requirement is educating the students. It's not doing anything for the PIs. So we need a continuing education issue. We need to address some kind of a continuing education issue for PIs. I will also say
that's real. We should underline that, because a lot of younger scientists are pointing out that while the requirement took effect, so younger people have had it, a lot of the PIs didn't have that requirement. So it's a...
I don't think I did. If I did, it was not memorable.
You played catch up, Peggy, very quickly.
Right, so I learned from being on a committee, and in fact, that's a way to teach PIs, is to put them on various committees so they can realize how important this stuff is. The other thing I will say is that Society for Neuroscience has the resources, has the intent, has the motivation, and has the experience to do this. When there are cases that are, I've painted a slightly Pollyanna picture, and there are cases that are not so restricted to one publication or even to publications only in Journal Neuroscience. And when I communicate with other journals, they simply don't have any experience or resources to handle an allegation. And that's a big problem. So we're the only one really in our field that's putting a lot of energy into it. We're willing to take a lead on it. But it's really a problem.
Good. Nick?
I'm delighted to see what you're doing. When I was working with ORI, we actually had a grant program to encourage professional societies to do more to clarify and set up procedures. And the program was ended because the societies were not interested. They were largely not interested because it was more challenging than they anticipated it was. And so the small amount of money that ORI had to give out for it was not enough to really get a major society to do anything. But the challenge I face at a very large university is, how do you get a discussion in a laboratory setting where it's very busy and where your students in a classroom on RCR will tell you, Professor Steneck, you don't know what it's like in the laboratory. You don't know what's going on there. So when we teach postdocs, for example, a course like this, very practical one we teach, they come in with things like, I have 5 different sources of data. How do I integrate them? And, nobody's told them how to do that. You'd be surprised at the number that are not even told how to keep a laboratory notebook and what goes into a laboratory notebook. I use the example of how do we reduce infections from sticking needles into people, catheterization. You train them, You post what's there in the lab, in the clinic, you talk about it, you debrief afterwards, and what happens? The infection rate drops down on what it was, 50, 60, something like that. We don't do that in research integrity. Everybody is so busy doing what they do, there's no time to sit and talk about these issues. And that's where the discussions have to take place.
No, if you have a response, please.
Two things. One is the RCR mandate that NSF and now NIH has is a mandate of time and attention, but not content. It hasn't been carefully thought through. Nor has there been any systematic attempt to evaluate efficacy. Both of those things are huge challenges. I would add that institutions, in my opinion, speaking for myself, as Peggy reminded me to say, thank you, could do a lot more by, in terms of institutional requirements for data management and control. We see allegations of research misconduct frequently where the respondent has no laboratory notebooks at all. And this has been going on sometimes for some period of time. And where manuscripts or grant proposals with fabricated or falsified data leave the laboratory and the PI has only looked at summary data, not the raw data underlying the experiments. Faculty at universities, of which I was one until very recently, are understandably resistant to draconian intrusion into their laboratories by the institution, but as a kind of peer mandated measure to increase vigilance of data integrity, that would do as much as any one thing, it seems to me, to prevent misconduct.
Thank you very much. I have a list of almost all of our commission members: Christine, Anita, Jim, and Raju, and Nelson. We're getting there. Yeah, please.
Thank you all for your comments. I want to just push you on one thing that all three of you just alluded to, but I heard the challenge of engaging scientists in what some of the ethical issues are, while recognizing that they have all these other pressing demands on their time, and that they see the most important thing as, doing what they need to do to get their grants, to get their publications published, to get promoted, whatever. So I don't think that the answer to that, and you all alluded to this as well, are the online RCR courses, because people do them while they're multitasking, because they don't really want to do them. They're just required to. They don't remember them. They don't probably learn much from them. And so I don't think that's the solution. So that's one question. What is the solution? How do you engage? How do you build in education in a way that people feel engaged but doesn't take away from all their other pressing demands? And then the second question I have is, you've mentioned the importance of keeping notebooks and monitoring data before it goes out for publications and things like that. I'm impressed by, what's happening in clinical research, where I always describe it as a team sport. We have multi-center, multinational clinical trials where, that engaged 1,000 people in one trial. How do you monitor the notebooks in that kind of case? Or how would you get people engaged in responsible conduct of research?
So hold those questions, hold your answers, because I'm going to take two at a time, because I just did a quick calculation and there's no way we'll get to the end otherwise. So Anita, I'll clump them into twos.
My question is very, very straightforward. I was struck by the fact that in listing the problems, you listed fabrication, falsification, lack of accountability, plagiarism, copyright violations, but I didn't hear conflicts of interest as such as among the concerns. So I just want to know, where does conflicts of interest fit into your picture of the ethical issues that neuroscience might encounter?
Good. And any one of you, I'm not going to ask all three of you to respond to all these because of time constraints. So who would like to take any? Nick.
Let me, to Christine's comment there, online I have a conflict of interest here, which I've declared because I work for a online training company, so you need to know that. But it has its place, and that is that there is a certain amount of basic knowledge that you have to have. The average researcher doesn't have that basic knowledge, so you've got to, in some way, impart that, and the most efficient way is to do it online. You then have to do the subsequent training in the laboratory to do more, obviously, to do that. What I think is you have to convince researchers that this isn't a diversion from their time. The people I know who do it well, it fits in with their normal work routine. It isn't something that all of a sudden, whoops, we have to stop and talk about integrity. It's just a part of their life that they do it. We're doing a grant proposal. What are we doing on conflict of interest? What are we doing on information and so on? Where's your books? I want to see them when I walk into the laboratory. So a good laboratory, it's just incorporated into that laboratory. It's the fact that the ones who haven't done it don't know how to do it, and they look at it as an imposition.
What about Anita's question about conflict of interest? Peggy?
Yeah. Yes, it's there. I didn't mention it, but we recently just published a slew of corrections because people had inaccurately not declared their conflict of interest.
Just briefly what they were. They had money from a drug company or from a
They had
device manufacturer, or
patents.
what was the conflict of
They had
interest?
patents on molecules that were part of the article. And these are published articles. So we simply added in that there was this conflict of interest, and that the reviewers were unaware of it at the time of the acceptance.
Jim?
I had a question on research culture. We've been talking a lot about policing and practices and policies. And maybe it's just an impression that I have, but actually it's connected with questions of conflict of interest and bias. You mentioned hypothesis-driven research, Peggy, and you all dealt with it. It seems to me in the physical sciences, more than the biological sciences, hypothesis is understood also to be, when one states a hypothesis, it's also understood to be a statement of bias. In other words, I'm exposing my bias. This is how I hope the experiment will work out. And so we see hypothesis shared very, very freely. Does the Higgs boson exist? Does it not? And many labs go to work on that. I wonder if that is a practice that could be employed. Is it just my impression that it's not employed as often in biomedical research? And if not, is it something that would help us address this bias question in the culture research? And you want to do two at a time, right?
Yeah, Raju.
I would like to ask a question, a clarification about the magnitude of the problem. So one is Nick Steneck said that by one measure, 1 out of every 2 investigators, could be considered a misconduct. And David, your presentation, you said that, Office of Research Integrity looks at 200 cases until recently, and they went up to 400 cases. And that, considering the overall number of efforts around the country, that number seems to be very small. So are we talking about two different things? What is the real magnitude of the problem that all of us and the commission has to worry about?
So why don't we start with Jim on openness about hypotheses and research bias, and how common is research misconduct? Who wants to take the first? Nick?
There are 2 worries about conflict of interest. One of them is that you just didn't declare it, and somebody needed to know that, and you violated the rule by not declaring it. So that's misconduct of a sort. It's not defined by. The more troubling one is that we know from research that funding actually impacts outcomes. That if you test the same drug, the people that are funded by the drug company and the people who aren't funded by the drug company come up with different answers. Okay, I worry more about the second one than I worry about the first one. Okay, because the first one, okay, it's a mistake, you educate the person, you do whatever you want to, and that's the end of it. The second one, if you don't know those built-in biases, you're going to make decisions about the use of that drug based on research. If you have too much of it, that's going to skew it in another direction. So that's where I worry about those kind of subtle things that they're not misconduct, but in the long term, they're having a much bigger impact on the impact of the research and the valuable nature of the research.
They're harder to expose.
Yeah, and I can answer the question very quickly about misconduct
Yes.
rates. What I said is misconduct is about 1%, okay? So by my estimates, ORI sees 1 in every 10 to 1 in every 100 cases that exists out there. I think David will agree that they don't see all the cases. Whether he and I agree on the 10 to 100 or not is another question. The 1 and 2 are these questionable practices, which in the long term, as I say, may have much more impact on the actual validity of the record and the public decisions we make, and that's what's most important. And those are the ones that can be as high as 20, 30, 40%.
David, please.
Just quickly on conflict of interest, another issue there is when there's an allegation of misconduct, it's handled by an institution that has a major financial commitment to the area of research and its major faculty and that sort of thing. Do they pursue those allegations as diligently as they would other ones? And for example, do they protect whistleblowers and others who may be collateral damage? And that I don't want to overemphasize this, but it's a non-trivial problem from our point of view. And with relation to your question about the magnitude of misconduct, I largely agree with Nick. We handle, because of our limited resources, only very serious cases. So we, the cases, let's say 425 that we take in for a year, we might, those are allegations, I say, we might open cases only in a fraction of those and make 13 or 14 findings a year. But that represents just the tip of the iceberg, not the magnitude of the problem.
Thank you very much. Nelson and Nita.
So I'll revert to the training I got concerning the uniform I'm wearing. You know, in the military, mission defines task, task defines standards, and we train to standard. And that's a mantra you can ask any private in the U.S. military. So, Nick, you opened your conversation by saying you're concerned that we haven't defined standards well. I will tell you that since I do lots of online training, not just for research ethics, but everything the Army can think of, that results in an online training. I mean, probably 2 or 3 times a week, not kidding. Training in some ways becomes unrestrained by definition of standard. And that's what I'm really concerned with. And it seems like in your initial comments, you also seem concerned that we haven't defined the standards we're trying to train people to. Given that individuals don't want to really uptake the training anyhow because it diverts them from what they perceive as the critical mission of executing science and developing resources to do more science. It would seem to me that if you had truly better defined standards, then the training wouldn't be as onerous.
Nita.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Nick had said about big science and big science projects, and about your unique concerns about big science projects, that they can create particular concerns about distortions of science, about motivations that are at odds with ethical progress in science. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to that and unpack that, since one of our charges is to think about the BRAIN Initiative specifically, and about unique ethical challenges that may be posed to that, and any thoughts that either of you may have about whether you agree or disagree with whether or not that's the case.
We have a standard here. We go Nick, David, Peggy, so why don't we do that here?
Nelson, I'm not sure what actually the focus of your comment was at this point. My personal view is that industry, and I haven't looked as well at the military, actually does a much better job of setting standards, and that universities, because of the academic freedom, are very reluctant to do that kind of same standard training. I'm not convinced that it would suddenly stifle all science if we had standard notebooks and a few other things like that. So I personally think in this area, at least, what industry does in training, and probably the military, is very good. You need that basic training before you can go on and do everything else. So I don't disagree with that. I don't know if others want to talk about that.
Peggy?
I want to first echo one thing that David said, which is that these institutional investigations, they have an inherent conflict of interest to protect their faculty members. And what we get back from the institutions varies from, I don't know a polite word for it, to fabulous. And there's, it would be just terrific if we got some help there, so that there was standards for how they have to address their inherent conflict of interest when they evaluate an investigation against their own faculty member. I also wanted to talk a little bit to the hypothesis as bias. I actually didn't mention hypothesis. I am not a hypothesis. I did not drink the hypothesis Kool-Aid. I think that, personally, my personal hero in biology is Charles Darwin. He never had a hypothesis. I think discovery is a big deal. I think that the way to engage scientists is, instead of making them scared of being accused, making them scared of what happens if they don't figure out how bad irresponsible conduct, irresponsible building of an experiment can actually be. So I was teaching in Paris when a friend of mine sent me this article, which basically showed that they tested for a p-value with every datum point, and between 25 and 30. There was a significant difference in something that there cannot be a significant difference of, the age of these two different cohorts that were not different. And that scared sort of the bejesus out of me, and I promptly had a lab meeting. And I actually think that's the thing to do, to get scientists to say, look, if we don't construct this experiment correctly, if we don't get the right numbers and the right groups, we're not going to get the right answer. And we're going to be part of this problem where science is not trustworthy, it's not reproducible, et cetera. So I want people not to be scared of us, but scared of the alternative.
Mm-hmm. Well put. David?
One of the mantras in the responsible conduct of research is that responsibly conducted research is also more productive research. You hear people say that. If somebody could demonstrate that experimentally, it would be huge. It would be no longer a distraction, as many investigators think, to do that training and to design work more carefully, but it would be an inducement to productivity.
The problem with saying, recommending that be tested is the default there is go on with irresponsible research until it's proven that responsible research is more productive, which is a totally unacceptable view, since we don't have research that shows that irresponsible conduct is productive. So I think it would be great to demonstrate that, but we know that irresponsible research is wrong, and that is at least an important starting point for a bioethics commission or responsible scientist. Please.
I think there may be some other spots on the continuum between irresponsible science and optimally responsible science. I think you could take sort of baseline science and then optimally responsible science and compare the differences and see if the latter is more productive.
So I think what would be important way forward, consistent with what you've just said, is to make sure that requirements, whether they be educational or training, are likely to be productive, right? You do not want to saddle any researcher with requirements that don't either on the face of them or through evidence help in producing good science. And our regulatory parsimony principle which is part of doing good ethics and good science, is meant to address that. And I think that's what you're suggesting, and we can very strongly get behind. So when surgeons now in many hospitals are required to have checklists that they go through, that takes some time, you have a checklist. There is evidence that that minimizes mistakes. And those are the kinds of requirements that not only are good to institute, but that you can fall behind and get them scaled up. And with Nick, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to adjourn for lunch and reconvene at 12:45. But Nick, go ahead.
There is minimum evidence that paying attention to integrity works. And I just wanted to say, if you think bioethics research is underfunded, we probably get 1% of the money for research and research integrity that bioethics gets for funding. So we're even worse underfunded. But it's known, for example, that if you have an overly bureaucratic IRB, people break the rules more often. So it's a very simple one. The climate survey that's now slowly starting to be adopted, few institutions that have looked at their, and MSU is one of them, has looked at their institutions, find out that their better departments actually have better climates. So if we could do more like that, I think we could actually develop the evidence that shows that if you run a good department and you have a good climate and other things, your integrity is going to be better and your scientific results are going to be better.
On that note, I would love you to share with us that evidence. On that note, we will adjourn for lunch and reconvene at 12:45, but not without thanking Peggy, David, and Nick for a really fabulous panel.